Module 2, we go over what to look for when you're observing wildlife. Habitat, sign to the actual animals. We'll be going over how to take field notes. When you're in the field and you see wildlife, you want to watch that wildlife as long as possible because it might only be there for a few seconds. And then immediately after, write down all the details you can so you can correctly ID that wildlife. This is a skill that you'll eventually hone on by the end of this course. Taking the right information while in the field is extremely important. One way to organize your thoughts and notes is to use a field data sheet. We have supplied you with a template on D2L. On this template, you can put the time and date, start time, finish time, air temperature, things like cloud cover, wind direction, speed, last precipitation type. A lot of this information, if you can't find readily in the field, you can find later online on the Weather Network. You'll also want to put a habitat description. Feel free to use the codes as described later in this module. You'll also want to put the latitude and longitude. If you do not have access to a GPS, a lot of mobile phones will have lat and longitudes, or you can look up on Google Maps or Google Earth and find the latitude and longitude when you return. In terms of what you want to put into the wildlife observations, you want to identify that wildlife as best you can, or if you can identify it, you want to use the 4 key observations as described later in this module in the boxes in the sheet, so that you can later reference those key observations and correctly ID this animal at a later time. One of the things that can help us identify wildlife is to describe the habitat that we see it in. Many species are associated with particular habitats, so a large part of this module will be going through what kind of habitats we may find in Ontario so that it can help us identify the wildlife that we see. Wetlands are areas that have been saturated with water long enough for the soil to become waterlogged. This allows for water-loving or water-tolerant plants to grow. There's many types of wetlands. 4 types of wetlands that are recognized in Ontario are bogs and fens, often called peatlands, and these are most common in northern Ontario. Marshes, this is the more common type, are permanently flooded or periodically flooded, and they contain plants such as cattails and water lilies. Swamps are wooded wetlands, and they can be found across the majority of the province. There's many benefits of wetlands. They can prevent floods, improve water quality, and provide valuable economic products and recreational opportunities. For our purpose, it's a great place to see a wide biodiversity of wildlife. Swamps are simply wetlands that have trees, wooded wetlands. They're typically very difficult to navigate and walk through. So usually when you're observing wildlife in a swamp, you're observing into the swamp on an outer edge. You can find species such as wood duck, a variety of frogs, and these kind of areas can provide refuge for larger animals such as deer or moose. When people think of wetlands, they usually think of marshes. These are open areas with emergent, submergent, and floating plant material. They're home to a lot of different flora and fauna, including waterfowl, raptors, frogs, snakes, turtles, a number of mammals such as mink, beaver, otter, or muskrat. This would be a great start to observe wildlife. Bogs are a type of wetland where it only gets its water from precipitation such as rain or snow. It's covered with thick moss, a lot of spongy peaty material. It has a bad odor to it. The water is highly acidic, and because of these reasons, you usually don't find too much wildlife. Some wildlife that do occupy these areas would be some songbirds, um, and large ungulates such as moose. You typically find bogs in central or northern Ontario. You'll seldom find bogs in southern Ontario. Fens are very similar to bogs. However, some of the water is from groundwater, not just precipitation. It has slightly less acidic waters and primarily dominated by grasses. It's more diverse in animal life than bogs, but less than marshes or swamps. Animals you may find here are a lot of birds, again, large ungulates such as moose, and you usually find these areas in central or northern Ontario. Open water is water where it's too deep for plants to grow on the bottom because light can't penetrate to the bottom. So you're not going to find emergent plants, submergent plants, or floating plants in these areas. These areas are refuge for a lot of migratory birds, such as ducks and geese and swans. You'll also have a lot of divers, such as loons, that would occupy these areas. Coniferous forests are forests dominated by coniferous trees. These are trees that retain their foliage year round, and because they're retain their foliage year round, they're called evergreens because they're always green. They're typically cone bearing for seed dispersal, and examples are pines, firs, cedars, hemlocks, spruce, or jupiters. Deciduous forests are forests dominated by deciduous trees. Deciduous trees are trees that lose their foliage in the fall, so they do not retain leaves throughout the winter. These leaves are usually broad. They change color during the fall before they fall off. And these trees typically in the summer and fall can produce nuts and in some cases fruit. Some examples are poplar, hickory, oak, maples, apple, or birch. Not all forests are strictly deciduous or coniferous. So in the cases where neither type of tree is dominating, we call it a mixed forest because it contains both deciduous and coniferous without one dominating the other. Grasslands are areas dominated with grasses, with less than 10% natural tree or shrub cover. These areas are excellent areas to observe wildlife such as songbirds or groundhogs. These areas will also contain other animals such as coyotes or ungulates like deer in dawn or dusk. If you're in an area that you can't call coniferous forest or a deciduous forest or a grassland, and it's dominated by shrubs and young trees, you're probably in what's called a shrubland. These are areas that are commonly found in between forests and grasslands, and also can be a product of human disturbance. These areas are usually rich in wildlife, including ungulates, small mammals such as rabbits or coyotes, and they are a great place to observe wildlife. Rural areas are areas that are outside the city but still inhabited by humans, typically farm communities and farm settings. These areas are great areas to find wildlife. They have a lot of coyotes, deer, a lot of migratory birds during the summer and fall, such as geese and ducks. You'll also find birds such as wild turkey displaying in farming fields. Because of the diversity of life with small rodents, it also brings in predatory animals such as owls and hawks. So, needless to say, if you have access to a rural area, this would be a great start to observe wildlife. We included an urban setting as a type of habitat because there's a lot of animals that you can find in the city. Even though there's little natural environment, a a lot of animals have learned to adapt to heavy human activity. So places like Toronto, you can still find a variety of wildlife. Wildlife such as mice, rats, pigeons, raccoons, and possums um, might be expected, but you might be unaware that in the middle of Toronto, you can also find coyotes, raptors, rabbits, or foxes. So before thinking about leaving the city, you might think of spending a little bit more time in observing the wildlife that urban settings have to offer.